We're going to go ahead and get started here because I know everybody has busy days, and we want to make certain that you have an opportunity to hear what Katie has to say, and also ask any questions that you might have. You are free to help yourself to anything that is on the refreshment tables, but we are going to get started. So I'm very delighted that Katie Paul from the Refugee Services Collaborative of Greater Cleveland is here with us today. Katie is are you really a staff person, more of a consultant to them, and she really, and she facilitates the work of the organization. So I'm going to just go ahead and welcome Katie, and we'll get started here. If you have questions during the course of the presentation, please feel free to raise your hand and ask that question, or you can hold it until the end of the program where we will have a Q&A session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again for having me today and participating in this training. The last 4 months have been so far from easy, very complicated, and I think terrifying in ways that even those of us who have been doing this for a while didn't expect. And so being able to come to the communities and provide this training and educate about what is going on is more important now than ever. I recently transitioned to facilitate this work, but I spent the last 7 years working in resettlement in Cleveland. I started at a number of settlement agencies. And for the last 4 years, oversaw the refugee health program that we work in practice. So, this work is something that I'm very close to, and I'm excited to be here to do this training with you all. And so I want to start with a poem by a British Somali refugee, Wartan Shirit. And the first stanza says, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well." And so the reality right now is that being an immigrant in the United States means that you might be running the mouth of a shark. And so this training is a lot of information. And the goal here is to say, we don't want to just be a bystander. We don't want to just let something bad happen to somebody. There's something we can do about it. So being a proactive bystander means someone who notices the potential for harm to occur and takes action. The request to do this training, you showing up, is you doing something. And so, like I said, we're just really grateful for this. The overview of the training, we'll start by giving some context to international newcomers in our community. Kind of give a breakdown on trends, numbers, and also what it means to be an international newcomer. Then we'll transition to going over changes from executive orders and memos that were signed during the after the inauguration on January 20th. It in no way represents all of the executive orders that have come through, but just the most significant ones to the immigration world. And then the last part of the training we'll look at how to be proactive in work and proactive in life. This was originally designed for employers, and so that's kind of why there's a focus on work, but it's completely relevant to everyone. So to start, international newcomers in our community, they can kind of fall into these 4 categories: asylees, refugees, humanitarian parolees, international students, and immigrants. Immigrants is an all-encompassing term for everyone who doesn't fit into one of those 3 categories. The RSC has historically focused on those who are coming to Cleveland on humanitarian grounds. So people seeking asylum, people who want asylum, people coming as refugees with refugee status from the UNHCR, and then also our humanitarian parolees who have typically been from Afghanistan, Ukraine, and Central South America over the last 3 or 4 years. So according to the UNHCR, over 117 million people have been forcibly displaced. And so those are the people who fit into the first 2 categories here, refugees, humanitarian parolees, and asylees. So that equates to about 1 in 69 people worldwide, which is incredibly significant. That number is also underreported just by the nature of how we capture these kinds of trends. These are also communities that have historically been protected from some of that anti-immigrant rhetoric from different policies because they're coming on humanitarian grounds. The people who are facing kind of the worst cases of genocide, or persecution, war, etc. So transitioning to international students, these are people who are on temporary visas, which right now puts them in a very precarious position because they don't actually have a legal status in the country. It doesn't mean that they are here illegally, it just means that they don't have that legal protection of being a permanent resident. For immigrants, there's a whole list of ways somebody can come into the country. It could be winning a lottery, there's certain like a percentage allocations from each country. You could be, married a U.S. citizen and that fiancé visa. But you also have exceptional talent, you could have ties to employers, you could be an entrepreneur or a seasonal worker. So there's a lot of reasons that people economically are allowed to come into the country and relate to the country, and this is kind of falls in the immigrant category. So number-wise, these are all for Ohio. So between 2019 and 2023, based off of the last census, over 590,000 immigrants contributed to population growth in Ohio. In Cuyahoga County, that's about 95,000 people. So this is a significant community, both in Cuyahoga County and in Ohio, and they represent about 6% of our population. So like I said, this training was originally designed for employers, and so immigrants build vacancies in jobs that a lot of people don't want: manufacturing, industries, factory work, farming, etc. And so that's how they contribute to our economy. Not to mention that they also bring a lot of value and skills and talents. You think of all of our healthcare systems and how many people come from the United States to work for those systems. So not only is there like the kind of the moral and humanitarian reason to support this work, but there's also that economic value as well. This again just kind of zooms in more on Ohio's population, and that in 38 states, all of so immigration contributed to population growth in 38 states, and of those 38 states, 16 of them was exclusively because of immigration. And so again, there's like a practical component to carrying out this work, although we like to appeal to this is the right thing to do. And really the simple that you do to yourself applies here. Ohio is also a great place for secondary migration. So we see a lot of people coming to the country, resettling in other states, going to other states, and then moving into Ohio because of our low cost of living, because we have a really significant established newcomer communities, and Cleveland's a great example of that. We have our Ukrainian community, we have an established Congolese community, Hispanic community, African community, Arabic community, and so we see a lot of people who originally start somewhere else in the United States and move into Ohio. So Cleveland's unique because we have people who settle into Ohio initially, and then we also have people coming in for various reasons. And so with all that's happened in the last 3 months, there are obviously concerns for the fact that people are not physically coming to the country, but there's also potentially more concern for the people who are already here, and so that's kind of where this training is particularly important, for the people who are already here. So this disclaimer is that, and it's also kind of why we share this presentation, things are rapidly changing, always. And so we're going to go over some of the 3 executive orders and a few memos that were signed that first week. We've already seen things change, and even if something has been redacted, there has still been a really significant impact to the work and to the people who these are designed to impact. And so this is all to say that this is not legal advice. It's just pulling information that really any of us could access by going online, listening to the news, etc. But just to give context about what's going on without giving legal advice. So first, just kind of differentiating between executive orders and executive memos. So executive orders are directives to government officials and agencies signed by the president, and they have the power of law if the topic is within the scope of the power of the president. So it's not everything, but it is immigration and it is foreign policy. why immigration historically is as complex as it is because very little of it is codified within Congress, and so it can change when the administration changes. And we've seen that pendulum swing really significantly in the last 10, 15 years. A good example of this is during President Trump's first administration, the settlement numbers were slashed to admitting only 50,000 people annually, and those caps were never realized. And so, at an average, 15,000 people across the nation were settled. When the administrations were transitioning between Trump and President Biden, Biden had set the settlement at 150,000, which was an historic high. And so, as the settlement agencies were coming from this place of basically nothing, a lot of infrastructure was torn down, the settlement agencies had closed across the country, we were also ramping and preparing for these like historic highs, and then the evacuation of Afghanistan hit. So quite literally overnight, we went from this period where we were resettling 8 people per month to having 4,000 people show up in Cleveland almost overnight. And so that the infrastructure is not there to support the people the way they deserve to be supported. And so even though we want to welcome people, we want to help people, there's just like a large systemic issue that kind of exists regardless of the administration. And so when the pendulum swings, there's just really dramatic impacts, not just for the people in the immigration system, but the people working in the immigration system. And that's what these executive orders, some of the most significant impacts really came to the people doing the work and the organizations doing the work. And so then the executive memos are similar to executive orders, but don't be as many requirements, and they're a bit more informal. And so you'll see that some of the resettlement agencies receive these memos that have dramatic impacts. And like I said, this is all because immigration is basically controlled by the executive branch. Ms. Sawyer, does anyone have any questions before we move on to the executive orders? So the first executive order was signed on January 20th, and this one is protecting the American people against invasion. This is really just pulling out the main points. Section 6 was the development of the Homeland Security Task Force. This is significant because historically ICE has only been as effective as how big it is, right? And so it's a smaller organization, it's a smaller entity within the government, but this Homeland Security Task Force is working to require federal, state, and local law enforcement to work together to carry out the mission of ICE and the work of ICE. And so in the first round of this administration, Cleveland did not participate in that. And they were allowed not to because they were their own entity. This executive order and the creation of this task force changes that. It requires cooperation from state and local law enforcement to cooperate with ICE to carry out their agendas. That is scary because it puts question marks over how different institutions interact with ICE and are required to interact with ICE. And we think about this in terms of the Section 19, which is the funding review of all non-governmental agencies thought to be providing services to removable or illegal aliens. So I guess the other caveat and disclaimer to all of these executive orders is that the analysis of the language is really significant. And it might seem straightforward, but there's actually, that's not the case. So the usage of terms like removable or illegal is more vague than what might be on the surface. And they're not legal terms. And so when we think about funding and the role of non-governmental agencies, that means that nonprofits working in refugee resettlement might be impacted by funding cuts if they are working with people who maybe have had their green cards expire. So it's not just people coming over maybe without documents, but it could be people whose visas have expired, whose green cards have expired. And so when we think about like, humanitarian parolees, our Afghanistan and Ukrainian neighbors who have come in the last few years, they came on a temporary visa. Those were not legal statuses. And so now there's this huge group of people who are in very precarious situations within immigration, but then also the people and organizations working with them are in the same position. Section 20 is also interesting in that it says the denial of benefits to illegal aliens. This already exists. people do not qualify for public benefits unless they go through a robust proving that they are allowed to receive public benefits. And that's typically people who are resettled as refugees. Those are really the only immigrant groups that are guaranteed public benefits, and they've gone through a ton of vetting, they arrive as permanent residents. And so this section of the executive order is an example of kind of the propaganda within them, that these are not people who typically qualify for public benefits anyways. So the result of this is that there is a lot of ambiguity throughout the executive order regarding the definitions. And then many entities and organizations are therefore interpreting it very broadly in terms of who they can serve. And I worked at an FQHC, a Qualified Health Center, before starting in this role, and the internal conversations were very much reflective of this concern, is that FQHCs are required by law by the grants that they receive from HRSA to serve anyone who walks through the door regardless of their ability to pay. That carries through to regardless of their immigration status. But now, with the language used in this executive order, does that mean that the FQHCs who are actually serving immigrants regardless of their status are in violation of this federal executive order and who lose their funding accordingly? And so there's a lot of really, really hard conversations about wanting to, obviously continue to serve the communities and everybody in them, but also recognizing the potential consequences of having federal funding cut to those organizations. And this is something where they're still navigating. There's a big question mark in terms of what the outcomes of these are going to be. But that's the truth of what organizations are facing right now. The second executive order we wanted to go over is the realigning the United States Refugee Admissions Program. And so, like I said when I started, historically refugees and refugee resettlement have been kind of protected from some of this political, just the politics of all of it. Largely because these are people who are the most vulnerable, who have people except have experienced the worst of humanity. So it remains untouched until this executive order. And so on January 20th, I think this is that 350 people, that number, this is why they were impacted. So the suspension of decisions and applications for refugee status were immediately halted. Anybody who was scheduled to travel, their flights were canceled. And the language in the order said that it would be reevaluated after 90 days to determine the best interest of the United States. That's not happening, nor has the administration had a change of heart over this. So refugee resettlement has been suspended basically indefinitely. And so resettlement works on the federal fiscal year, so October 1 through September 30th. And so when administrations change, that federal fiscal year starts with one and then moves on to the other. And so in quarter one, so October through January, over 350 people arrived in Cleveland, kind of anticipating that there were going to be cuts to the refugee resettlement programming. And so people were fast-tracked to get here. But then on January 20th, all funding was suspended. So you had people who were relying on resettlement agencies for at least 90 days to help with rental assistance, utilities, finding jobs, connecting to schools, getting into a doctor's appointment. And that stopped quite literally overnight. And then there were people who were scheduled to travel, planning on traveling. That was also stopped. Flights were canceled. Afghans have kind of been a focus here, is that many Afghans who have come to the United States have worked with our government or our military in some capacity. And a lot of people in the military frequently recognize them as veterans themselves, that we couldn't do what we did in Afghanistan without their assistance. And so these were people who were scheduled to travel, who were promised a green card and legal permanent residence, and that was canceled. So this is the one that just kind of obliterated what existed of resettlement in the United States. And some things have been adapted in terms of funding, but these initial orders did enough damage that the action doesn't matter. And so that's where we really rely on local communities to step in and provide financial support and physical assistance to set up homes for families who to help navigate public benefits, apply for food stamps, apply for health insurance, get them back to parents, help enroll the kids in school. By the end of this week, whenever it was, January 25th, some agencies have already cut staff. They were working over the weekends to try to figure out how to make things work and staff and move these different programs. But significant cuts had to happen because there was no funding for them. And as of now, the 90-day termination hasn't changed anything. So we went from these historic highs over the last 4 years where we resettled 1,400 people to literally 0. The last executive order that is of relevance here is protecting the meaning and value of American citizenship. So this is all centered on birthright citizenship. And it says that children born in the United States will only become U.S. citizens if their mother or father is a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident. This is in direct violation of the 14th Amendment, which is birthright citizenship. This is scheduled for oral arguments on May 15th with the Supreme Court. And federal judges have been blocking this, but again, it reflects this idea of who is allowed to be here, it's in violation of the Constitution, and can impact so many of our newcomers. Transitioning to memos, this one was dated January 24th. This is the one to refugee resettlement agencies that formally halted the funding for refugee services. And so people who arrive to refugee resettlement programs are supposed to be guaranteed 90 days of support from the resettlement agencies. Each person is allocated, I think it's like $1,200 as a one-time payment to the resettlement agencies to help support rent, get people just enough settled, which is not enough anyways. And then that also helps obviously fund the work of the resettlement agencies, and this helped it. And so the impact was the elimination of rental assistance. We are concerned about people being evicted because of their inability to pay. Elimination of case management. These are the people that they rely on to navigate these systems, to navigate these problems. And the elimination of assistance with bills. So kind of ties back into rental assistance. I always like to share that the State Department goal for refugee resettlement is for people to be financially literate and self-sufficient within 90 days of arrival. Really neither of those things. And so to put that on people who don't know the language, who have experienced things that are beyond so many of our conceptions and understandings of 90 days is nothing, it's a drop in the bucket. And so this is a system that is designed in a way that's not supportive, and then memos like this just take away what little is already there. The other one is directed to non-governmental agencies who receive federal funds. And so this one got a lot of attention because it was a temporary pause on all federal government funding, so kind of zoomed out from refugee resettlement. This impacted other benefit programs like food stamps, like Medicaid. Grants that came from the federal government, again, to support the work of FQHCs, those were halted. Clinical trials have been halted. This is one that I think has gotten a lot of attention and just impacts quite literally everything. It has been officially rescinded, but again, the fact that this was, when it was put out, damage was already done, and it just really highlights the recklessness, even if these are being challenged or rescinded. This is some pieces of actual legislation. The Lakeland-Riley Act is for crimes that are typically without incarceration are now mandatory for at least 1 year for those of suspicion of being unlawfully present. So they're trying to frame crimes that are like, traffic violations or misdemeanors as crimes involving moral turpitude, and those are automatically deportable offenses. So they're kind of trying to reframe the charges to carry out deportations. At the state level, we have House Bill 26, which was previously House Bill 666, and it force and requiring state and local law enforcement to comply and cooperate with immigration. Ohio is not pushing back on that. They are cooperating with it. And so forcing cooperation with local law enforcement. So like I said, the administration when Cleveland said no, they did not participate in that. That's different now. And if you are in the United States illegally, that automatically means you are in Ohio illegally, which results in a mandatory jail sentence. And at that jail sentence, it's actually easier for ICE to detain you if you're already in custody. So again, it's this cycle of trying to corner people and capture people, using already unjust systems to continue to do so, and Ohio is participating in that. And like I said, Samantha, who's our chief counsel with Asia, when I was going through this with her, she really wanted to stress questioning what illegally means. That's not a legal term, right? So it's not just people who are coming without documents, it's not just people who are maybe stuck in the process of applying for asylum, which is an international human right. But it's somebody who actually has a green card, but that might expire. Somebody who has authorization in the United States, and that expires. People who are on temporary visas like students, and that expires. Now these are all people who can fit into this category of an illegal immigrant or an illegal alien. And so, I think the platform was, we are doing this to prevent and protect against illegal migration, but questioning what that actually means is really important.
Katie, how long does a green card last before they have to do something?
Yeah, typically it's 10 years once you have it. And so I am most well versed in the process for refugees, and it's really different for everyone. And so if you are working with somebody who is in this process somewhere, it's best to consult with their immigration attorney or reach out if they don't have one. But refugees, for example, they arrive in the country as legal permanent residents. They still have to apply for their green card a year after arrival to physically receive it, because getting the green card is what leads you to citizenship. And so I think there's a provision that if you're in the United States for a certain amount of time, you can kind of bypass the green card to citizenship, but that's not the status quo, that's not the standard. So the green card is just really important to trigger the clock for citizenship. And so for refugees, they typically get it a year after arrival, and then they have 7 years to get citizenship. If they don't get citizenship by year 7, they risk losing access to public benefits and like SSI. So if somebody's on disability, and supplemental security because of a disability, they could lose that if they're not citizens. So the green card timing is actually really important. Yep. Okay, so that's it for the executive orders and legislation. So it's very heavy. Are there any questions about that before we transition more to what we can actually do real time?
If they're here, do they pay taxes?
Yes, yep. Yeah, so if people are working in the United States, immigrants pay taxes, it comes out of their paycheck just like the rest of us.
I'd make a comment, the scariest part of that first first executive order is section 19, when it says thought to be.
Yes.
It's not is.
Yes.
And that could be, now we're just suspecting that anybody with gray hair is illegal.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for calling attention to that, and 100%. And that's the whole language that we've been seeing in the settlement executive order, is that if there's a suspicion of somebody being illegal or a suspicion of somebody being a threat to the American public, and so it's really important right now to consider who we are thinking of in that context. And so I remember having a conversation with a friend, it was in a group of people. She's from Afghanistan, she's been in the country for 12+ years, and we were talking about all of this, and she's like, well, I'm safe, right? And I was like, no, because of this language. And the look on her face is something that I won't forget, because it's right? My kids are here, I have citizenship. And I'm like, yes, but like, you are a hijab. You are not white. You have an accent. And I was like, so the language in this bill makes it so that any of us could potentially be threats. But historically, they're not going to look at me. They're going to look at you and question you. Not even question you. They're just going, we're seeing now real time that they don't care about the legality of any of this, or if you have your documents. And so, yeah, thank you so much for calling attention to that, because exactly that's the most terrifying part of all of this.
Is the Refugee Services Collaborative going to different organizations or, like, for example, a mosque, and just announcing or offering to do something like this so that they're aware? Because I don't think many are aware.
Yeah. So a lot of the organizations that make up the collaborative have put on a lot of debates, have worked with newcomers who are leaders of their communities to try to disperse this information. I think some of our challenges have been this notion that they believe that they're safe here, right? And they should believe that. We want them to believe that. And that's not true. And so sometimes it's, there's a lack of awareness because they don't speak the same language, because they don't have access to the technology that keeps us updated on these kinds of things, or because they just have so much other stuff going on that they're trying to do for their well-being, for their survival here, because these systems don't actually support them. So like there are tons of gaps, I think, in outreach, and so again, this is where being able to speak with all of you is great, because if you have connections with communities and individuals, you can kind of help advocate for them, and even just mention it, right? This is something that they should be thinking about. And as we transition to, like I said, what we can do, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of I don't know what to do. But there's just some kind of like tangible. This is something to hold on to that you can share with community members who might not know. And so the first thing is focusing on interactions with law enforcement and then utilizing red card resources. Has anyone heard of the red cards before?
No.
Okay, great. So hopefully this is something that can be very useful to you all. Like I said in some of the executive orders, who law enforcement is has also kind of changed within immigration, right? And it's because of those executive orders that are requiring compliance from local and state officials. And so law enforcement in immigration is no longer just ICE, but it's local law enforcement, sheriff offices, the FBI. USCIS is a function of the immigration system, obviously CBP, and then the Child Protective Services. These are all now considered as law enforcement and potential threats to immigrants and immigrant communities. And so, like I said, this sort of through the lens of employers, but I think it should offer helpful advice to you all in your day-to-day life here as a community, and then potentially even in your places of work. And so it's really important to develop policies related to handling these situations. These are some things to consider in kind of policies and procedures. A lot of it is tied to your constitutional rights to search and seizure, which I think is under the Fourth Amendment. Generally speaking, if the public is able to access it, think that law enforcement can access it. And so the example of like a healthcare facility, anybody can walk into a healthcare facility, not everybody has access to the electronic medical record, right? And so law enforcement doesn't need a warrant to enter the healthcare facility, but they need a warrant to do anything else because of the security and protections that are in place at the federal level, regardless of anyone's immigration status. And so I think, thinking of a church, yeah.
Would that, I was going to ask about regarding the church.
Yeah.
Are they allowed to come in here?
So under this kind of framework of the public can come in, law enforcement can come in, yes. However, you are allowed to say that law enforcement officials need to identify themselves immediately upon entry. If you keep a visitor log for people, that's something to consider to implement so that you have a record of who has entered the facility. You can create a specific sign-in sheet for law enforcement. poster or something on the sign-in sheet so they can't see who is here. And it's important to have like a point of contact if law enforcement was to enter. So I don't know if you have, maybe an attorney like in the congregation or somebody you could contact, but having a single person to say we cannot do anything until you speak to this person is really impactful because of these warrants. So there's two kinds of warrants: administrative warrants and judicial warrants. ICE is notorious for using administrative warrants to like get their end goal, even though they hold no power because they're not judicial warrants. And so it's not uncommon for ICE officials, or at this point just kind of other members of law enforcement, to come in, say that they are looking for so-and-so, and presenting this administrative warrant. And so if you are the person who's receiving that, in that moment, you're met by people in positions of power. This feels like a very official process. You don't want to be in violation of that. But these administrative warrants actually hold no power. So having a point person who can look over the actual warrant is helpful, because technically they don't have any legal right to do anything until it's a judicial warrant. This being said, this is very small. You can Google kind of the differences between judicial and administrative warrants. So this is an example of an administrative warrant. It still looks very formal. If you were handed this and didn't know, it would make sense to think that this is real. This is an example of a judicial warrant, and so you can see that there's more details about the judge who signed it, that a specific address and things that they are looking for in the warrant, as opposed to a general, this is what you're looking for. And it has, if it has an expiration date, it must be current and not past. So they are weaponizing these warrants to do the things they're trying to do, and that can be really intimidating if you're the person receiving them. So just even being aware that there are two kinds of warrants is helpful. I think unfortunately, what we've seen in the last 3 months is that they don't really care about due process. That even if they don't have a warrant, it's sometimes not stopping things from happening. If people present the documents, it's not stopping things from happening. And it ties right back to the thought of someone or the suspicion of someone potentially being. And so this is the part where it's just, there's not like a good way to frame this. There's no silver lining to this process. Yeah.
Wasn't it the administrative warrant that they used to arrest their judge? It wasn't a judicial warrant.
Oh, the judge was just arrested? Yeah,
It was administrative.
Yes, yeah, and so I think we are seeing these practices that have existed in immigration seep out into other areas. And so, that's terrifying. But it's, like I said, even just being aware that this stuff is happening is really important, is a way to advocate. And positioning yourself in ways that if something happens, you kind of have something to fall back onto, and the ability to say, categorically, this is wrong.
So are you saying that if I'm standing at the door and ICE walks in and presents me an administrative warrant, that I can simply say, I'm sorry, I don't see a judge's signature, could you please leave the property because I haven't.
Yeah, you're not welcome here unlawfully, like, you have no legal, you as a person has no, or the entity has no legal obligation to comply.
Answer that.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? On like administrative?
I was going to bring up with that red card thing.
Oh, yes.
Is that so is that the physical, like, there's a picture there?
Yeah.
A physical thing you could, or where can we go back on that?
Hold on. My slides are like moving about, which is fine. But yeah, so I can send actually a link to Connie where you can access the red cards. They're translated into a bunch of different languages. Actually, I can just pull them up right now.
they're on your site, so you can go to RSC and you can have
Yeah,
access
you can go
to
on the
red cards.
site. They're, like I said, they're very accessible. You can order them, and then they're like,
You can also order them in various languages.
exactly. And you can also just download them from your computer and print them off. So that is always an option, but they, like I said, they give you basically like your Miranda rights, right? You have the right to remain silent, you have the right to not speak to anyone without an attorney present. Again, this doesn't mean that ICE is like, accepting this. The due process piece of all of this is very mentally absent right now. But this is, like I said, you just Google immigration red cards, it takes you to this page. They are wallet size, so you can give it to the people in your community or individuals that you know that they have them. But yeah, the red cards are probably the most we have in terms of what we can give to people right now to help navigate this. Yeah. Verify as a judicial warrant. In the event that it is a valid judicial warrant, then there is a legal obligation to comply with it. Always make sure that you can get a copy of that judicial warrant. And another recommendation is being able to record any interaction that's happening, because that might be the information that we get on the arresting officers. You're hearing stories about people dressing in plain clothes and then end up being ICE officials. So they are being sneaky about a lot of this. So yes, recording any information is important. Unfortunately, when people are detained, like that, things are happening. This is like a disappearing comes into place. They're not tracking where people are going. There's supposed to be like a 72-hour waiting period before somebody gets deported. That's not happening. And so once people are in custody of ICE, it's really challenging to figure out what's going to happen next to them. Which, again, is just another horrific thing for this. But you can contact an attorney if you have one. The RSC on our website has a list of the legal societies in Asia, Catholic Charities has an immigration law firm. So you can reach out to them. They might be limited in what they can do once somebody is detained. But it's always good to contact someone. Or if you have somebody who's not sure what their status is, again, reaching out to their immigration attorney to get a better idea of that.
Katie?
Yeah.
What do we do if, say we're at a restaurant and ICE comes in and starts to accost people in the restaurant? What should we do? Should we just video it with our phones? Should we step in and say, ask who are you and why are you doing this?
Yeah, I mean, I think like civil disobedience a lot in these moments. There was a clip, I think, of somebody maybe in like New England area where community members had actually like formed a human barricade around like the car that ICE was trying to get to. So if there's a comfortability of getting involved and physically getting yourself between, the person and ICE, there have certainly been situations where they back up, right? They don't, for as bad as all of this is, when things get hard and people challenge them, there is evidence that kind of shows that they back off. Obviously, being able to communicate with the individual that these are the rights that you have, regardless of your status as a person in the United States, is also helpful. But yeah, I mean, I haven't been in that moment where ICE has raided a place, but potentially intervening and just physically being a presence in that interaction, it has showed effectiveness in having people stand down.
This was many, many years ago in a different circumstance, but I was in an orphanage in another country with mostly the workers that were from the country. And we got a heads-up call that the government was going to come into the orphanage and that we should not confront them. We should gather the children, sit together. If they ask questions, answer their questions, but do not try to stop them from doing anything, because that would not be a good idea. Just gather, sit calmly, pray if we can. They went through, they sort of looked for whatever they wanted, asked a couple questions, and they left. But from that experience, I think if we would have been locking the door or stopping them, it would have turned out bad.
Yeah, so there's like nuances to these encounters, right? That like, and the arresting of the judge is a really good example of this, right? She was kind of sheltering people, and then she was arrested. And so there are, it's hard to know how a situation is going to evolve, but generally speaking, you don't want to increase the contention between the parties, right? And so, yeah, that was the approach at NFP, was that we don't want to get in the way of them doing what they are allowed to do, which is kind of circling back to if the public can access it, law enforcement can access it. So they're allowed to step foot in the prison, right? But what happens from there is they can't just access the EMR, right? They don't have access to just because they're law enforcement, they don't have access to all spaces. But you want to kind of de-escalate the situation where you can, and that can be really hard when these really bad things are happening. And obviously the ties to the Holocaust are kind of running rampant right now, and when you even think of being a bystander, you think of like people who kind of let these things happen, and I don't know that that's always like a fair analysis of things, because you don't know what's going to happen, you don't want to escalate situations. The rule of law is kind of out the door right now, so it's also hard to know what to expect, and so I think that like I said, we're kind of seeing these moves of civil disobedience, where it's like, yeah, we're gonna have to do things that maybe legally we aren't allowed to do, but it's to protect people and their rights that are being infringed upon. But it's really hard, and it's scary because we want to do the right thing, but right now the law is not lining up with that. So yeah, generally speaking, de-escalating, you don't need to give any more information than what they're asking for. That's the other big piece, right? So yeah, I hope that helps get bullish, yeah. So I'll just kind of wrap up, and I think members of your community have already done this, working with the Hope Center, donating to the federal agencies. Any like kind of tangible goods are best directed towards the member organizations, because the RSC is not an official entity. And so that's kind of how we direct people. We direct them to member organizations. The QR code should take you to our website. This is our email. You can always contact us. This support at RSC Cleveland comes to me. So we're always happy to answer questions. If you are working with a member of the community who has questions, feel free to reach out and we can try to connect them to the right place. Happy to continue to do more trainings. We do other kind of one-on-one education. We do community events that are also like celebrating our international community in Cleveland, which is really important right now. So yeah, please consider there. Are there any other questions? Open it up for discussion.
Katie, thank you so much for being here. Let's give her a round of applause. We are grateful for your advocacy, for your place in very complicated times, giving your time to come here and introduce us to what's happening and how we can respond. Do be aware that you can stay afterwards to have more conversation. We may be able to stay around for a little bit and answer questions. Also, on Thursday night, we have the Abrahamic dinner, which will be in Trinity Hall. There's a QR code on the flyer back here on the table, which we still have a lot of food to be had, so help yourself there. Click on that flyer, because that gives you a chance to then register. So on Thursday night, we're kind of taking your guidance and having only kind of registering. Those who have registered will be able to come in. If we're not familiar with somebody, we may not be able to bring them in. And as we come in, there will be a sign-up table there for us to confirm your presence. Yeah.
There will be childcare at the dinner as well. Which
Yeah, childcare will be.
me and my husband both coming instead of just me.
There are a lot of kids. There are a lot of kids will be, and the kids will be in here, correct? Will be in
here, and then they will have a pizza party in room 108 and 109.
Okay.
And there are right now 19 children coming.
So in the midst of a very uncertain time, this is a very important message to send to our Muslim, Jewish siblings, is that we are a place of welcome, and we want to make it safe here for conversations and solidarity. So feel free to sign up and be a part of that gathering Thursday, and stick around for a conversation. Thank you.